Welcome back to my channel. Today, as you can see, we have a special guest. I would like to talk about being in your 20s. I am more than halfway through my 20s at this point, and while I am very excited about that fact because the movie 13 Going on 30 was very instrumental in my childhood and adolescence and teens and early 20s, it made me think about how far I've come and what choices I have made that have brought me here. Also, what privileges I was born with that allowed me to make those choices. And all that kind of wrapped up in my head and formed in this idea to do a bit of a retrospective. Now, nobody needs a memoir from someone in their 20s unless they died or did something amazing. So this isn't going to be about advice on how to survive anything, because what do I know? But I want to talk about that books that made me think and made me feel like I knew a little bit more. These are not my favorite books of my 20s. These are not 4 books I would inherently recommend, because one of them I don't even like anymore. But looking back on the last few years, I see the effect that they had. And all of these are nonfiction books, which is always fun to talk about nonfiction on BookTube, because I feel like we don't get to see it as much. So the first book I want to talk about is Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey. So when I first saw this book on my roommate's bookshelf, I had no idea who Dave Ramsey was. I knew nothing about the syndicated radio show. I didn't know about the lecture circuit. I didn't know about his rise to real estate wealth, only to have it all crash and burn for him to build his wealth back up again. I really didn't know anything about the whole financial independence, financial freedom, financial education scene. And this book is on this list, even though I do not like it anymore, is because it's what really kicked me in the pants and made me realize I needed to control my financial destiny. The phrasing. I needed to get my finances in order, and I needed to do it now, because as time went on and I had more bills and more responsibilities, it would only get harder. So what I liked about this book was how simple and specific it was. Save $1,000. Don't use credit cards. Put all of your extra income towards debt. Get a second job. Sell your possessions. If you live like no one else, then you can live like no one else. That was the big tagline. And I would watch a lot of the YouTube videos of people doing their debt-free screams, and I would be all inspired. But in practice, it was a struggle. At first, I thought $1,000 would be enough, because the book told me it'd be enough. But after, breast cancer scares and breaking things in the apartment, the airline that I had booked a flight on ceasing to exist, so being stranded in a foreign country, I learned that $1,000 is not enough for an emergency fund. And so for a while I was yo-yoing between paying all this debt off and then putting it all back on because I hadn't accurately prepared. Also, he has a very tough love mentality, which I can see would be helpful for some people, but I'm sorry, these glasses are so loose, they are killing me. He has a tough love mentality, and that can be helpful, but also there were many situations, at least on the videos I watched online, where I felt that there was a fine line between giving advice and berating, and that kind of attitude, especially an attitude that did not seem to take into account the different circumstances that certain people are born into, that they have very little control over, how that affects long-term growth. I have to give props to this book, because without it, I wouldn't have learned about Tasha at One Big Happy Life, or Chelsea at That Financial Diet, or the Budgetnista, or any of the other financial freedom and financial stability people and organizations I learned in my research. But his philosophy does not work for me. It did not work for me then. It does not work for me now. I am thankful for it, for introducing me to this world. It was the impetus that I needed to get a second job, which was something that I had been considering. But living a very austere and strident lifestyle for X number of years to then live the life you want, it doesn't really work for me. Especially when, while there are always things that I know I could give up if I needed to, there are certain things that I simply refuse. So, for example, the category of my budget in which I spent the most of my discretionary income was travel. I simply was not going to stop flying to see my partner every other month. I simply was not going to stop flying to see my mother a few times a year. There were certain things that I was willing to give up, and many things that I did, But it really led to a kind of a destructive mentality in which even when I would make small purchases that A, I needed, like floss, or B, that made me happy, like, oh, I'm going to get a $2 donut today, I felt a lot of guilt. And I don't want to imply that his whole philosophy is based on guilt, but when you are hearing stories of people sleeping on air mattresses for 3 years, or literally only eating rice and beans, or, not going to any weddings or funerals or birthday parties or any celebratory events for the X amount of years they're paying off debt, you realize how intensely some people have sacrificed for this dream of being free from debt. And I think it's admirable. But that strategy just did not work for me. And what I also found really unsettling about it was in his 6 baby steps that he lays out to financial freedom, getting rid of all your debt except your mortgage comes first, and then saving for retirement and saving beyond the $1,000 comes after. And even when I was trying to follow his philosophy, I just couldn't bring myself to do that. I couldn't bring myself to stop contributing to my retirement funds in order to have more money to pay off my debt. So it's not a book that I would strongly recommend to anybody, but I do have to give it props where that is due for, one, introducing me to the concept of financial freedom and financial stability, giving me the impetus to do something I had been kind of thinking about, getting a second job, and also teaching me lessons about boundaries and teaching me lessons about falling so intently into one type of ideology that it ends up being destructive, and learning how to walk away from that to incorporate some elements and get rid of others without feeling a sense of guilt. So, Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey. The second book I want to talk about is So Good They Can't Ignore You by Newport. And if you're wondering why I don't have any physical copies of these books, it's because all of them were e-buys on Google Books, and I watched all of them on a computer screen at work. Most of the time during lunch, but it is what it is. Sometimes hit that 3 p.m. slump, want to do some reading. This book came into my life because I was actively looking for answers to the follow your passion mentality. I was in a place in my career where, I felt guilty complaining. There were certain things that just were not okay, but overall I felt like I was in a much better space than a lot of people my age, and specifically the field I was in. And I was toying with this idea of leaving for the idea of something better versus just kind of putting your head down and grinding and getting what you can where you're at. And So Good They Can't Ignore You really debunks, or his attempt is to debunk the idea that if you follow your passion, you will be happy and successful. There's a lot of different frameworks he introduces in this book. I actually had to take notes to keep up with them, and I didn't mind that, but just something to keep in mind if you're someone who wants a lighter read. But one thing that really struck me was this idea that if you are convinced that you as an individual are predetermined to have a specific passion in life, and all you have to do is go out and find it, your life is going to turn out a lot differently than someone who is looking to curate or create their passion, or someone who is looking not necessarily for a job to give that to them, but a job that provides access to the things that will create that. Let me explain. So he gives tons of different examples of people who have autonomy in their position, who make good money, who are able to be creative, who are able to work on a cause that really matters to them. And all of them are doing things that they didn't even know existed when they were younger. And when I say younger, I don't mean kids. I mean prior to 7 years ago. These are people that made choices such as, well, I'm not saying I want to work in this field forever, but this is a great opportunity, and let me try this now, and then end up being an expert in something new and cutting edge. Or people who are looking to go to school for one thing, found something else they thought would be a good fit, did their absolute best, hit all the notes, worked really hard, and worked themselves to a position where they had more flexibility and freedom, and were like, actually, I think I want to take some of these skills, combine it with this other thing I'm interested in, and strike out on my own. It was really, really validating for me to distance myself from the idea that this perfect job already existed and I had to go find it, as opposed to, What type of market are you in? What type of skills do you need to be successful in this market? How can you push yourself and stretch yourself, get feedback, be on the cutting edge of what's happening? And how can you leverage your experience and your talents into an environment that creates happiness? There are some people in this book who were in the field they knew they wanted to be in, but because of, I keep saying autonomy and flexibility, those are some of the things he mentioned a lot. The people who felt they were very stifled, who were bogged down by bureaucracy. I mean, there is a woman who I found really inspiring who had she was a freelancer, and essentially she was a freelancer, she was an entrepreneur, but she was able to leverage that after years of being strategic and smart and working hard, and built a position where she works on a consultation basis. So again, she is still in the same field she was back when she wanted to quit her job, but it's the way that she is able to do the job. Now, some downsides of this book, I will say, this is another book written by a white man, and I did not appreciate how binary some of the examples were. If you just do A, B, C, and D, you will be successful in this field, because women, people of color, people with disabilities, we all know that those kind of hard and fast rules are not applied evenly to everyone in the field. And so it's not a book that claims to be the universal answer to finding success or fulfillment in your job, but there were certain parts that felt a little too simplistic for me, considering experiences that I've had and experiences that other people have had. And while I did not take this book and immediately apply it to my life, I was not in a work position where I felt, oh, I just have to do X, Y, and Z, and then I can turn this into something valuable for me. It really was the philosophy of it that struck me, because while I've never believed in, predestination or soulmates or anything like that, when it came to work, I did kind of have some of those similar ideas, that I had to find the job that was the perfect one for me, as opposed to create it, or as opposed to intentionally trying things in different fields, trying things with different people and different backgrounds, and seeing what I can be uniquely suited to do, and also intentionally stretching myself. There absolutely was a point where I was, frustrated with my management. There's a point where I was hitting all the marks, I was doing everything I needed to do, but I wasn't pushing myself. And I don't mean pushing myself necessarily in the amount of work I was doing, because I was and am a hard worker, but I wasn't looking at the scope of what I was doing and trying to see, how can I move this entire conversation forward? How can I insert my own innate curiosity and creativity and my desire to ask challenging questions, and see, where can I insert myself? Where can I find specificity and create a name for myself with that work that I'm doing? And I eventually ended up doing that. But as with many things, I think sometimes when you first read these books, it doesn't mean the next day you implement it. That stuff has sit and marinate. So that is the second book, So Good They Can't Ignore You. The third one, which is probably, I'd say, the most important one, if there's only one book you read from this video, please let it be this one, is The Defining Decade by Meg Jay. Literally the whole thing is about your 20s. Where did I get this book from? I think, again, I was just searching on Google Books during a lunch break, help, somebody, I'm 20. It was not recommended to me by anybody. I just found it. It's written by someone who works in the psychology field. And again, it is a mix of her personal opinions, certain surveys and studies, but also these individual stories of people who exemplify what she's talking about in this chapter. And there's so much in it. It's not a huge book, but it impacted me so much. I've read it multiple times. I would say the biggest things that it helped me with, the biggest lessons it taught me, was not making a decision is the same thing as making a decision. Choosing to not apply to school, choosing to not take a job, choosing to not reach out to that person for coffee. The absence of choice in and of itself is a choice. And there's also a fear that I had, that I feel like a lot of people in their 20s have, about, well, what if I pick something and work really hard at it, and I'm really passionate about it, and I get there and I realize I don't want to be a teacher, or I get there and I realize, oh, I actually preferred working 9 to 5 as opposed to being a freelancer. I had a lot of fear about the idea of wasted time. And one concept this book introduced me to was the idea of social capital. These are the things, the experiences, the unique parts about yourself that don't like fit a little box when it comes to, applicable skills, but are part of the larger narrative, a part of your larger brand. Brand isn't the word she uses, but it was so like, oh my gosh, a light bulb moment, because I had acquired a lot of social capital from being an archaeologist. I had acquired a lot of social capital from my studies and digging in Israel, the experiences I had. And I always felt so insecure about those experiences because they have nothing to do with the career that I've chosen. But per the examples of the book, that was how people remembered me. That's how people knew me. That's what they wanted to talk about in interviews. And by leveraging that interest in that experience, but also the interdisciplinary skills I had learned, on a tell in an office, really, really helped me. And this book helped me realize how I could use those unique things about myself that may not fit into the box that I think is necessary for a role, how I could use them for a larger purpose. There's a whole section about childbirth and child rearing that I kind of skim over every time I read it because I don't want to have kids, but that's really interesting too. I find it's common among women to say, oh, I want to have kids, but not right now. And by the time they get there, they're like, okay, I'm ready to have kids. It's like, wait, if I said I want to have all my kids by 35, I would have to start now. Like, there's just so many things that we have kind of vague ideas about that if we don't plan for, we will get to a point where we are in a situation that we could have avoided. I feel like I'm not selling this book well enough, and that frustrates me. But when it comes to physical health, when it comes to work, when it comes to love life, she breaks the book up into these big chapters and really enforces the idea. Her main thesis is that your 20s are not throwaway years. The 20 to 29, or I guess like 19 to 30, whatever, these 10 years matter, and they can have an effect on the rest of our lives, and that shouldn't be something we find scary necessarily, but it has. We need to give it the respect it deserves. We need to give our 20s the respect they deserve. And that doesn't mean we can't still have fun and be young and be silly, but not taking them seriously, choosing to not really start our lives till 30, means that we won't be able to have the lives we envisioned when we were younger about being 30. And that really stuck with me when I first read it, because as I said, 13 going on 30. Ugh. So Defining Decade by Meg Jay. If there's only one book you read from this video, please let it be that one, because it's specific to being in your 20s, and it has an overview of topics that I know at least one or two of them you would find interesting. And even if you're not in your 20s, this applies to other books as well, but don't let the title fool you, because there is a very strong message of, well, don't think that because you're 29 or 40 or however, these things no longer apply to you. Again, it's geared toward people in my age group, but there are certain challenges, certain questions, certain exploration the book asks you to do that I think would be valuable at any age, especially if you feel like you are kind of drifting and you don't really know what the point of the time that you're in is for. So Defining Decade, Meg Jay. And the last book, I say this one for last because it's the thickest, it's the biggest book, and it has the most like actual science in it, scientific studies and researcher references and surveys, so it's a little harder for me to condense, but it's called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. The Power of Habit is about the power of habit. It jumps all over the place, from personal habits to shopping habits, the way corporations look at our habits to better understand us and sell things to us, the way monkeys' habits inform humans' habits. It sounds really boring, but what actually I find that the book is fascinating because it's trying to do too much. I mean, you'll learn about the ways in which losing parts of a person's brain affects what they're able to do. You'll learn about how Target spies on us with our shopping, and with a scary amount of accuracy can tell when a woman is pregnant based on what she buys. And before you think it's like, oh, she's buying like diapers and pacifiers, no, like it's stuff like how many towels and what types of lotion. It's crazy. Excuse me, it's not, it is wild. And again, a lot of personal things. The biggest thing I took away from it, or I guess a practical thing I took away from it, was tracking your habits before you try to change them is an integral part to growth. That we often, and by we I mean humans, think of life as making these big changes and it's a new chapter and I'm cutting off all my hair and I'm quitting my job, and like those things are great. I did all of those things. But when it comes to sustainable change, it is the small things. It is what we do every day. It is individual choices that build over time to create and maintain the life we want. And as a very, very small example, this book helped me understand my Instagram habit. I found myself going on Instagram at work a lot, and not even because I really enjoyed it or there was anything interesting, but like multiple times a day, I'd be leaning over my chair, bad posture, looking at my phone. And that book, the exercises in that book, helped me realize that I was going on Instagram to escape what I was currently doing. And I know that sounds really overly simplified, but it wasn't just, I don't want to work, I'm going to be on Instagram. Because the days I don't want to work, what am I doing? I'm reading. It is that every time I had an email or a task or a voicemail that caused a certain amount of physical discomfort, that caused a certain amount of mental worry and anxiety, I wanted to escape that feeling by mentally escaping the task. And I would do that by going on Instagram. And once I started tallying and tracking how many times a day I was just opening it on habit to escape, it was like over 25. It was just way too much. And of course, once you're in, the algorithm makes you want to stay. And when I started tracking when it was happening, I could tell what tasks were triggering this idea, this need to flee. And once I could tell which tasks I was trying to avoid, then I could see what was it about them that I was worried about. Was this something that I had never done before, like building a budget, and I was freaked out about it? Was this email from a certain coworker that I don't have a great relationship? So even seeing their name in the subject line was like, it was so eye-opening to me how such a tiny, minuscule task, opening Instagram at work, something I'm sure we all have done, revealed all these deeper things to me about my relationships with my coworkers in some cases, about fears about my own insecurity, my own imposter syndrome. I don't know how to do this thing, so I'm just going to avoid it. And again, this is just a really small example, but I share it because it's so tangible. The book is like, I think this is a little bit of a critique of the book, that it can just, like, this man picks up and puts down threads, and I'm like, we're talking about Alzheimer's, we're talking about monkeys, we're talking about shopping, we're talking about, relationships. Okay, cool. It's not as well organized, I would say, as the other books I've read, and it's something that is on my list to reread, but I'm trying to like prepare myself for that kind of haphazard nature. But it was a really helpful, practical tool in looking at the habits in my life, and not only how do I change them, but where they came from, and what two seemingly innocuous tiny things, what do they reveal about my larger life? So I have been talking very loudly and gesticulating wildly, but I hope that gives you an idea of the way some of these books might affect your life. And specifically, if you're in your 20s, Total Money Makeover, Power of Habit, So Good They Can't Ignore You, and The Defining Decade, I would mostly recommend. And we read books to escape, we read books to empathize with other people, but we also read books to learn things about ourselves and to grow and develop. I kind of want to add something else to this. I mean, I've been ranting about the books a lot and perhaps not giving as much context about how I feel about being in my 20s and personal lessons I've learned, but maybe we'll save that for another time. I'm really enjoying talking about books so far, but I'm also already thinking about the other types of videos I might want to make and the other things I want to discuss. And while I'm sure there are ways to weave books into literally anything that I would possibly talk about, I'm already 3 videos deep, and I'm already considering what it might mean to kind of open up the topics on this channel. But whether in your 20s or whether you have survived onto something bigger and better and greater, I hope these books are helpful. Stay safe out there.